Story 1. We are seeing in real time that what looked good in theory becomes a practical joke under a real stress test. Societal decay that pushes a government toward corrupt seizure and overreach. Checks and balances worked only as long as people in those positions believed in them. It was a social contract with no mechanism to prevent the depraved from trampling it. Story 2. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. September 17, 1954, is my birthday. Before the signed Constitution had been distributed, Elizabeth Willing Powell asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, Doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." It is ironic that the Republican Party, led by President Trump, is doing its best to give us a monarchy. In a video, President Trump is talking about Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Story 3. It was a great concept that was not emphasized until it was needed, and then it failed. Story 4. I do not think Americans realize how vulnerable their system is compared to other developed nations. That creates a lot of problems. Story 5. Checks and balances and American democracy are dead. The Fourth Reich is in full control. Story 6. We used to have that, but not anymore. When power is concentrated in the executive office, masked secret police with no identification detain people in the streets and journalists are targeted for their politics. So it is clear those rules no longer apply. Many call it the second coming of Hitler, but it more closely resembles Franco-era Spain or Pinochet-era Chile. Story 7. It seems that those can all disappear if the president appoints nothing but loyalists to his cabinet. Story 8. Trump installed people who would ignore checks and balances. I believe dozens of state representatives are being forced to toe the party line under threat from supporters of Make America Great Again. Those who remain silent are likely being coerced. 2 members of the Supreme Court also appear distressed whenever they are in the same room as Trump but still give in to his pressure. Story 9. Checks and balances are only as good as the integrity of the people enforcing them. So yes, we are doomed. Story 10. The system is not designed for the American people. It is designed to protect the rich, and that needs to change. It is time to take it back. Story 11. The fall of the Supreme Court of the United States marked the end of any checks and balances. America is now under authoritarian rule. Story 12. The system of checks and balances no longer exists. It depended on electing people with honor and integrity who believe in the Constitution and our republic. Supporters of Make America Great Again decided these traits were no longer desirable. They destroyed America on November 5, 2024, when they elected a man they knew would ignore the Constitution and seize as much power as possible. Story 13. It was a great concept but poorly executed. It requires the party in power to be willing to keep itself in check. It also requires its voters to care about what the United States has stood for more than 200 years. All of that is down the drain now. We saw a taste of it in Donald Trump's first administration, and apparently 78 million Americans wanted more of that. Here we are. Story 14. Those checks and balances were lobbied away over 4 or 5 decades by wealthy people. They continued to buy media after they eliminated restrictions on media ownership in multiple areas. I will not go through it all. It is a modern return of the robber barons amplified. This time they have a more friendly and pliable government. We are becoming an authoritarian oligarchy. How fun. Story 15. You can clearly see how it worked historically. It was a good system, but Congress became less and less effective at doing its job, and 2 individuals effectively used their positions to destroy its ability to act as a check on the other branches of government. Newt Gingrich fostered an atmosphere of generalized war and vilification between the parties, and Mitch McConnell found a way to nullify an opposing president's ability to appoint Supreme Court justices. Much of what we see now follows from the actions of those 2 men. It would be better for the United States and the world if neither had ever existed. Story 16. Those checks and balances are only as good as the people willing to enforce them. In other words, they are wholly dependent on people acting in good faith. Right now, the right wing and the Republican Party at large have completely abandoned those checks and balances in favor of maintaining their own power. Story 17. You cannot rely on checks and balances to fix a system, because any check on power must be carried out in good faith. The United States is where it is because half of those in power have failed to act in good faith, and the other half have shirked their duty to defend the Democratic Republic. Story 18. They did not work. The country has been taken over by a Russian asset and his minions. Story 19. When the legislative branch delegates its authority to the executive branch, and the executive and judicial branches cooperate to undermine the legislative branch's ability to apply checks and balances, and when half of the legislative branch also undermines those checks and balances, a takeover has already occurred. Now it is only a waiting game for everyone to accept reality. In short, checks and balances work only when they are used. Story 20. It works when the branches of government jealously guard their power and take seriously their oaths and duties under the Constitution. Story 21. I just wish the checks and balances would show up for work. Story 22. Democracy rests on the premise that people will do the right thing and be open to compromise. Unfortunately, recent events show that if enough voters lack moral restraint and have a penchant for criminality, the system can crumble. No amount of discussion changes the fact that half the country saw a figure widely regarded by critics as a grifter and accused of criminal and sexual misconduct, and still voted for him. That stain may never be erased. Story 23. I would say the Supreme Court of the United States failed the United States Constitution when it gave the president immunity. Story 24. Checks and balances only work when people actually hold each other accountable. Story 25. They were put in place years ago for a reason, and now all of that is being changed. Story 26. Checks and balances relied on people having morals and decency rather than greed and a thirst for power. Story 27. If you give control of all checks and balances to the no checks and balances party, they stop existing. Story 28. Ha ha ha. Oh wait, you're serious? Story 29. Those days are over. Checks and balances only work if both parties adhere to them. We are now under a fascist regime. Story 30. Mahatma Gandhi famously remarked, "Western civilization? I think it would be a wonderful idea." In response to a reporter's question about his views, I feel the same way about the checks and balances we supposedly had in place. Story 31. You need something far more advanced than this. The design was, honestly, incredible for 1776. It was engineered like something from a future time, but not this far in the future. There are two measures that can correct or prevent these problems, and both must be implemented for them to work. Unfortunately, this would require a full government overhaul, including scrapping the Constitution and so on. 1. A total lifetime ban on lobbying and bribery for anyone in any government position, enforced by law and requiring a permanent absence of privacy. If you run for office, the public will have access to your bank accounts, emails, text messages, and other records. If you want to hold office, you give that up. That will drive malignant sociopaths, narcissists, and psychopaths away. Put a police state panopticon on our politicians, and only politicians, for life. Only people with nothing to hide will run for office. Boring people, good people, always watched by the public. 2. Establish a simple, fully transparent, actively logged pre-bunking system against scams, disinformation, and misinformation, managed by a balance of experts and randomly selected members of the public to counterbalance false experts. Use that system to vet data and to throttle or deprioritize content identified as disinformation or misinformation in platform algorithms. This is tricky because any system designed to stop disinformation can be abused to suppress real information, which is why the public balance against experts is essential. It is imperfect, but in a non-trusting state, nothing better is likely to work. Anything less will allow the population to be misled and the government to be run by nefarious players in the shadows, paid off by the rich and powerful. This is worth investigating because the government is not what it once was and is actively becoming autocratic and authoritarian. There is nothing to save. Story 32. What you are seeing is the will of the people. There is a large minority who want a fascist ethnostate, and the rest simply cannot be bothered to do anything about it. Checks and balances would work if there were the will to use them, but there is not. Story 33. Our government only works if both sides are on board and operating in good faith. The Republicans jumped ship in 2010 and haven't cared since. Story 34. It did not work. The Senate is an abomination that has placed the majority under the thumb of the minority, and the Electoral College does the same. We should abolish the Senate and increase the size of the House of Representatives to between 3,000 and 5,000 members, with a 6-year, one-term limit. Abolish the executive branch. No single person should have that much power. The House would elect a leader to speak for the country. The Supreme Court should have 10-year term limits. We should abolish states' rights and give all lawmaking and taxation powers to the federal government. Story 35. It seemed great on paper. It turns out a treasonous party can simply fill all the seats that need to act with loyalists, and the whole thing falls on its fascist face. Story 36. There were no checks on corporations, and that was the fatal flaw in the design. Story 37. They don't work when the Republicans are afraid of their own rank and file. Story 38. They did not work. They relied too heavily on the honor system, and once someone with no sense of honor appeared, things in the office fell apart very quickly. Story 39. You're a fool if you think they're inherently bad. Do you really want Donald unchained? Story 40. It works much better when one side can have veto power over one branch of the federal government. The problem is that Democrats are too leaderless and rudderless to do anything about it. Story 41. It is more about the power that the legislative and judicial branches have given up. I expect a sharp pendulum swing the other way when a Democrat becomes president. Story 42. The parties have undermined checks and balances to the point they almost do not matter. The party that holds the majority in Congress will not act as a check on a president of the same party. Similarly, when opportunities arise, the president and Congress can work together to install partisans in the Supreme Court, further eroding those checks and balances. Story 43. All systems of government are human-made and depend on people to uphold their tenets. We are witnessing what happens when the bad kids realize they can take over the classroom. Story 44. We are at the point where the final check is needed. Too bad we are crying on Reddit instead of taking our Second Amendment rights to the streets. Story 45. The takeover had already happened when our Supreme Court failed to uphold the Constitution. Story 46. When you have complete control of the Department of Justice, the military, and the intelligence apparatus, the law is what you say it is. The courts only have power because Donald Trump has not decided to defy them yet. He will when he is ready. The checks and balances are gone. American democracy is dead, even if people do not understand that yet. Story 47. I was 6 when the bicentennial happened. It marked the 200th birthday of the United States of America. It was a huge deal. Flags and patriotic decorations were everywhere. There was renewed interest in government and educational information for children about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I even won an art contest with a picture of Paul Revere having cereal for breakfast with his horse. The contest was sponsored by Kellogg's. I never in my wildest dreams, not then or until now, thought I would watch as we fell short of the finish line to reach 250 years. Story 48. The lifespan of most democracies is about 300 to 400 years. I cannot find any that lived longer. Story 49. Are they checks and balances or facets of a totalitarian regime that make it impossible to overturn? The founders of the United States Constitution clearly wanted absolute wealth and power. The man who actually wrote the Constitution, James Madison, was very Trump-like and did not want to add the Bill of Rights to what he considered a perfect document. He was a frail man who avoided direct service in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. I suggest reading the anti-federalist opinion letters, especially the Brutus essays. They anticipated exactly what would happen. We would not be in this predicament today if people knew the true history of our country rather than the two distorted versions presented by the political parties. Story 50. Democracy relies on voters having the good sense to elect people with fundamentally democratic principles. Trump manifestly does not, and neither do the majority of Republicans. They are authoritarians who should not be trusted with a bowl of Jell-O, let alone anything else. Dumb or bigoted voters voted for Trump because they were either too ignorant to realize what he was going to do or because they actively supported it. Too many other voters stayed at home because they were too naive to think that everything would be okay either way. Story 51. Those checks and balances only worked because everyone agreed to go along with them. They were not tangible. They were simply the way things were done. Now one side has decided they do not matter, and you are screwed. Story 52. Concerns about checks and balances date back to the Bush administration. We allowed too much power to the executive branch through executive orders and similar actions. It is nothing new, only exacerbated during the Trump administration. We need a president with altruistic intentions to steer the country back on course. That president would need to close the political divide and have both parties work together in the common interest of the nation. I do not believe we will ever see this, whether we like it or not, as each side becomes more extreme with every election. Story 53. Sounds like a good concept. We should try it out sometime. Story 54. They will be tested. It does not look good with a corrupt Supreme Court and so on. Story 55. Those checks and balances should have been written into law. Relying on decency and norms is why we are in this position. Story 56. Checks and balances only exist when you elect people who care about having a functioning government. When a country elects rabid fascists, that system breaks down pretty fast. Story 57. Checks and balances fail miserably when the two branches of government fail to police the executive branch. When they let impeachable behavior slide as normal, it is over. This is very much the situation in the United States of America right now. The Constitution is being destroyed, but the Republican Party does not care. Story 58. Checks and balances work only if those who check are willing to provide balance. Currently, they seem hell-bent on rubber-stamping the authoritarian and xenophobic desires of their masters. Story 59. The only checks and balances are million-dollar payments increasing billionaires' balances. Story 60. The checks and balances were dismantled by the Supreme Court with Citizens United, and oligarchs began taking over, first quietly and then openly. The right turned to voter suppression and gerrymandering to remove more checks and balances. The Supreme Court later ruled that a president is effectively immune from nearly anything resembling a king. We are now in a quasi-oligarchic religio-fascist brotatorship. Story 61. You should have had those thoughts decades ago. Your democracy is gone. Story 62. They were clearly norms that people respected and adhered to. Then we got someone in office who does not care about the country. Story 63. It turns out they were all just gentlemen's rules that can be ignored at any time. Story 64. The checks and balances only work if people are willing to take a stand. We have seen that, as of now, any white-run organizations will show their bellies to Trump. Story 65. The problem is lifetime judicial terms. There is no surefire way to remove someone who becomes an obvious problem if they have allies. Thomas Jefferson identified this issue during the Aaron Burr treason trial and tried to address it in the early days of the country. Burr, Jefferson's former vice president, allegedly planned to manipulate a war with Spain to trigger a civil conflict decades early, and although the public opposed him, Chief Justice John Marshall protected Burr through carefully worded legal reasoning. If American democracy is to return to normal, lifetime limits on judges must be removed. The Supreme Court of the United States is corrupt beyond measure right now because of it. Story 66. They are being eroded every day in favor of a king. Story 67. We have checks and balances only when the other branches actually check each other. Story 68. That is like pissing down my back and telling me it is raining. Story 69. It was nice when it worked, but that has not been the case since the early 20th century. Story 70. The checks and balances are failing at a rapid and alarming rate. I am concerned about what is happening, and I am wondering if now is the time to leave the country. I never thought I would have to think that way about living here, but it is clear this administration is volatile and seems to be getting worse. How long before this administration comes knocking on my door? Story 71. It is up to Americans to do something about it. Everyone just wants someone else to handle it, including those responsible for checks and balances. Clearly none of them are doing their jobs, so who is to blame? The American people are uninvolved. Story 72. Yes, American democracy. Few understand that once elected they can act without fear for at least 4 years, and there is little that can be done about it beyond voting them out. The system does not enforce penalties for lying under oath, so that carries little weight. Add to that the ability to manipulate institutions such as the Supreme Court, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Communications Commission, gerrymandering, and the collegiate system, and if there is no will to penalize theft, fraud, perjury, and overreach, there is neither check nor balance. There are also uneducated and malicious voters. We are watching in real time the decline of the United States. Story 73. There were more concepts of checks and balances, apparently. Story 74. I am beginning to think that our winner-take-all system, as opposed to the parliamentary system, causes real issues. One advantage of parliamentary systems is that if a government fails, a new election can be called. There is also more compromise because coalition governments are common. Story 75. We see that those checks and balances were more guidelines than anything else because real checks and balances would lead to accountability. Story 76. The only true check on the power of a democracy is the consent of the governed. Once the governed consent to authoritarian nationalism, it makes no difference what checks and balances exist in the form of government. Story 77. Republicans made a deal with the devil to win control and, in return, agreed to destroy the Supreme Court. Story 78. I think the checks and balances system has failed to prevent political discrimination. When one party gains complete power over another, there are no real protections to prevent the minority from subjugation, harassment, abuse, or even death. While we continue dialogues and uphold civil rights protections for race, religion, and sexual orientation, we are killing one another and carrying out violent reprisals over political differences. This has been happening far longer than we like to admit and affects high-profile figures such as Melissa Hortman and Charlie Kirk. Instead of confronting this, many people try to steer the conversation away, insisting it must be something else unrelated to politics. They reduce incidents to micro-explanations, leaving no room to address crimes motivated by political inclination. Therefore, I believe the checks and balances will only be fixed if we enact a new check and balance between political parties, so that the law and society's degree of concern apply equally to all people regardless of political belief. Story 79. There are no checks and balances when both major parties are bought by the wealthy. America has rejoined most of the world. Marx was correct and capitalists can read, so that is not likely to change until the masses begin ignoring the rules. Story 80. The Constitution was written with the belief that there would not be political parties and that ordinary people were not to be trusted, only wealthy men. Those beliefs were wrong and have proven harmful as we are finding out. Story 81. Checks and balances only work without rampant corruption. It has been barely holding together for a while now because the parties are bought by the donor class, which is not you or me. Story 82. That is how our government works. Just because the Supreme Court of the United States has appointed Trump king does not change that. Story 83. You can have all the checks and balances you want, but if people do not defend them, they will not matter. Technically, the system of checks and balances is still functioning. The executive branch is overstepping while Congress, which is supposed to be the most powerful branch, is not contesting it. Story 84. They clearly need to be updated to get with the times and to be proofread. Whether charges are filed in a timely manner should not depend on the decisions of anyone worried about re-election. If someone is found to be in the wrong, there should be specific punishments. To avoid delay, when an official takes office, they should acknowledge what is expected and what the penalties are for violations. That acknowledgement should justify setting firm punishment standards so judges cannot use unprecedented situations as an excuse to delay justice. Story 85. We used to have that before the Supreme Court was bought. Story 86. It has failed us on every level, and we have no choice but to sit quietly and watch the National Guard march on our cities and install the new authoritarian republic. Story 87. I agree with our former vice president. The system is too broken. Story 88. It sounds like a nice dream at this juncture. Too many people are happy to see the government punch down on any and all opinions they do not like. The American right has made a full 180-degree turn from its long-standing position of decrying restrictions on the First Amendment. Story 89. Unfortunately, we seem to have bypassed the checks and balances protecting democracy. The Supreme Court, aligned with Make America Great Again, has allowed the orange fascists to operate above the law, and the grand old party aligned with Make America Great Again has done nothing but help him. We're kind of fucked. Story 90. The best summary I saw was that when the concept of checks and balances was put to a stress test, it failed. It functioned well when standard norms and mutual respect existed between the branches. But when they colluded to seize power, the system broke down. Story 91. I think those checks and balances do not mean shit if people do not enforce them. Story 92. The states are the final check and balance. It would be very difficult to take over. You would have to be in a civil war first. And without California and New York, you would have a hard time. A full takeover would be impossible without violence. It would not be like Germany. Remember, they are basically the size of Pennsylvania. Munich has about the same land area as Philadelphia. Story 93. It works to prevent upstarts, but it is helpless against a long game. It is impressive that it lasted so long in such a corrupting environment within government. Story 94. It was supposed to be upheld, and they have failed. This is not just hyperbole. Democracy is dead in the United States because of this Kimmel incident. The Constitution means nothing anymore. Story 95. I think we are seeing the consequences of the three branches working together to erode the system. The Founding Fathers did not foresee this. It is a twofold problem. Politicians have become performative because of television and social media, so people tune them out. At the same time, citizens have become complacent and less vigilant after growing up in times of peace and prosperity. Combine this with malicious propaganda, expanding presidential power, and poor economic conditions for most people, and you get our current situation. Story 96. Any system of checks and balances can hold 999,999 times. It only has to fail once. It appears to have failed. I said this a decade ago. People told me the institutions had always held and would again. I guess they did not. I am sad to have been proven right. Story 97. It is a good idea. I think we should put something like that in place if we ever get American democracy. Story 98. I think they are a great idea. Unfortunately, it looks like they do not actually work. Story 99. They only work when elected officials are people of integrity. This sort of thing has cropped up before, and it has always been due to human error. Story 100. I think they don't fucking work when 99% of government officials are paid actors. Story 101. It is terrifying to live through. I am grateful I live in a solid blue state, because if the federal government collapses, at least I can safely remain here. I can imagine red states becoming dangerous, with white Christian nationalist regimes replacing democratic government, similar to the movie Civil War. The scariest part would be local policing, because I live in a slightly more conservative suburban area. For the first time, my husband is getting a gun license. We have decided not to travel to red states if we can avoid it. Story 102. The problem is that the two-party system creates a single point of failure. Story 103. Those checks and balances are simultaneously the final guardrails holding the remnants of American democracy together. They are also the abused mechanisms that created the gridlock and voter apathy that led to this mess. Story 104. Checks and balances are being systematically removed by Trump and his allies because his voters allow it. The founders focused on checking elites, but our democracy is being undermined from below. They did not foresee that a majority could support someone like Trump, who is power-hungry, amoral, corrupt, and dishonest simply because he endorses their broad prejudices. Story 105. It works and will continue to work. Every 4 years, a different group on social media claims it is the end of the world. Story 106. Checks and balances? Laughable. Those guardrails have been eroding. They exist in name only. Story 107. The founders developed the Constitution on the idea that political parties would not exist or that they would not constitute significant numbers of representatives. Each branch of the federal government would, in theory, jealously protect its own power. Once a political party controls two or more branches of government, it will sacrifice the power of one branch to strengthen another and seek greater control with less accountability. The system of checks and balances was defeated by the two-party duopoly long ago. For decades, we have lived under a system that only checked power when it encroached on the power of the other party. That protection is gone because Donald Trump and his supporters in the Republican Party do not plan on leaving power or sharing it again. Story 108. It was a house of cards. A fable we all believed until this year when we discovered there was nothing there. Story 109. I think that they would be a great idea. Now, how would you go about implementing this? George Washington on political parties. Combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. The Supreme Court was set up as an independent, apolitical body, insulated from political pressure by lifetime appointments and the fact that justices are not elected. It has caused more problems in the United States than it has solved. It helped fuel the Civil War. It later backed business over the private individual and became a brake on reform. After a short period of post-war liberalism, it swung to the right and has stayed there. The Constitution was written to give Congress 70% of the power and the executive 30%, with an independent Supreme Court. Today, it is 65% executive, 35% Congress, with a conservative Supreme Court. Story 110. They were a great idea until people became lazy and corrupt, and they are pointless when the president ignores them. Story 111. The checks and balances are not meant to prevent takeover. They ensure power does not become too centralized in one institution and that the three branches of government retain some independence. If voters elect one party that is anti-democratic across all three branches, democratic institutions can be systematically changed and dismantled. Story 112. Someone said this about coronavirus disease 2019. It applies here too. Much of our planning assumed that people would be good and do the right thing. In reality, because that is not how people are, the plan falls apart quickly. Story 113. The Republicans will not check, and the voters were foolish enough to give them a majority so the Democrats cannot provide balance. I hope they shut down the budget regardless of the cost. That is the only way to stop this runaway train headed for a total collapse of democratic values. Story 114. One of the best features of any government. The trouble is that Congress became incredibly lazy and gave most of its power away. We are seeing the results of that now. The best way to fix the nation, aside from outlawing gerrymandering, would be for Congress to claw back its control. Story 115. Unfortunately, it was an honor system, and I was mistakenly naive to believe the executive would have the nation's interests at heart, not just their party or themselves. When the president is the leader of their party, the enforcement mechanism of impeachment is effectively off the table. Supreme Court rulings, even if they go against the administration, can be ignored and there is little anyone can do about it. Story 116. What checks and balances are you talking about? Donald Trump literally walked in and took everything. Nothing stopped him. Story 117. It is quite evident that they are not functioning and that the United States has moved beyond the flawed democracy label it had before the current administration. Story 118. Congress is a check on executive power. What if all of Congress decided to abdicate its duties and allow the president to do whatever they want? Checks and balances only work if the people uphold them. Story 119. Checks and balances are non-existent if ignored by sufficiently bold crooks. Totally inadequate. Story 120. We maintained our democracy by honoring norms that were not codified. Now we have lost it because we elected a president lacking integrity and character. Story 121. The Supreme Court of the United States undermined it. Our Constitution doesn't mean anything anymore. Story 122. Right now, it feels like checks and balances are theoretical at best. Story 123. Where are my thoughts right now? They are supposed to be there, but they are not. Story 124. They have failed, and anyone who thinks they are going to save us from the Nazis is delusional or complicit. Story 125. If they can be removed by executive order, then they are not checks and balances. They are suggestions. Story 126. It only works if everyone agrees. Otherwise, with so many bad actors, laws and practices such as Citizens United and gerrymandering, and a complicit media, the system of checks and balances quickly falls away. Story 127. There are no checks and balances when Congress and the judiciary do not act as independent bodies. Story 128. I think that would be a great idea. We should try it next time. Story 129. It only works if the branches check one another. But when a leader fills all branches with loyalists, there is no pushback or oversight. The Supreme Court is a joke, the executive branch appears corrupt, and the legislative branch is willfully ignoring the problem, awaiting a visit from former President Trump. Story 130. We technically have them, but it would be better if they worked. They depend on sufficient opposition in each branch to prevent overstepping by the others, or on those in control of a branch having strong compunctions against overstepping in the first place. Story 131. I thought that was what the gun-nut gravy seal clowns were for, that all the school children being slaughtered in the United States would be worth it. Story 132. The current system assumes the conflict will be between different branches of government. Political parties, as we have them now, are not accounted for and short-circuited. Story 133. It was pretty neat in theory, but unfortunately, like anything else run on the honor system, it only takes a few bad actors to ruin it for everyone. Story 134. As a principle, checks and balances are a good idea and should not be discarded. The problem is that the Constitution was written with the fundamental assumption, not borne out in reality, that the other branches will be motivated to restrain each other's power and that people in positions of authority within those branches care about good governance to some degree. The system collapses quickly. If, for example, the president, the cabinet, several high-level judges, and a significant portion of Congress all believe the president should be able to do whatever he wants as long as he is their ally, and they are either too blinkered to realize or do not care that those actions will eventually turn against them. Story 135. It never really did. It was always a magic circle, and eventually someone was just going to ignore the rules and break the contract. Story 136. It used to work pretty well, but all governmental systems collapse under the pressures of greed, self-interest, and othering. Please note I said pretty well, not perfectly. Story 137. The checks and balances only work if there are people who are willing to uphold them. We are seeing Trump and his followers of Make America Great Again disregard everything the Constitution holds sacred, and they have just enough power to avoid accountability. Story 138. Checks and balances only work if the people who enforce them cannot be bought. Right now, the system of checks and balances has failed. Story 139. It is a nice theory if only it worked. The fact that there are no riots in the streets is amazing, considering what Nepal and East Timor have been doing. Story 140. I feel like everything I was taught about civics in school was total bullshit. There are no checks and balances. They simply do not exist because sycophants do not care about their constituents. They care about money. Citizens United, money and politics, and lobbyists have harmed all of us. Most importantly, people I would not trust with a pencil voted for a man who said he would be a dictator on day one. Story 141. We are seeing in real time how flimsy those checks are when one party controls everything. It certainly doesn't help that the party is being led by a megalomaniac. Story 142. We had those. The Supreme Court of the United States has washed them away in favor of their owner. Story 143. It is a key point of social studies still taught in school. I would be fired for saying it has catastrophically failed us, and we are on the verge of what happened to Rome a little over 2,000 years ago, when Caesar dissolved the Senate and the Republic and installed himself as emperor. Story 144. They work when you have integrity, ethics, and morals. Politicians on both sides have never heard of any of these things, so it is all unraveling. Story 145. Are the checks and balances in the room with us right now? Because the fascist party is actively ignoring them and everyone is allowing it to happen. Story 146. The checks and balances really seem to exist only to prevent the working class from gaining any power. Story 147. Too little, too late. Now we must wage a second civil war for independence from oil companies and foreign control. Story 148. Unfortunately, it has become entirely us versus them rather than what is actually best for the country. They are not the only country on this path. Story 149. The Founding Fathers could not imagine a world in which the vast majority of elected officials do not have even a shred of integrity. Story 150. The system is flawed. The main weakness lies in the Supreme Court, where too much unchecked power is concentrated. It was a mistake to allow one president to appoint so many justices. Story 151. It requires good faith actors. We're seeing what happens when they are not. Story 152. It's great because it took hundreds of years and multiple generations for it to be removed and replaced by a dictator. We know it works. It just needs some adjustments to allow a new country to prosper. Story 153. Trump stacked the Supreme Court. Republicans control Congress and are all subservient to Trump. They are also openly gerrymandering to ensure that Democrats won't have a chance to take back the legislative branch. There are no checks and balances anymore. Story 154. One party does a fairly decent job of governing when it is in charge, forcing the other side to stoke anger and create faux outrage to justify its existence and get paid. This happens even though liberal policies are actually healthy for them. That anger produces a police state that is as harmful to them as it is to us. It feels like checks and balances are highly incompatible with capitalism. If you could remove the money incentive, a system of checks and balances would work. If people were not afraid of losing their jobs and there was no enormous incentive like receiving a super yacht for oppressing a minority group, it could work. Unfortunately, that is not how America operates. If you step on people and dehumanize them, you can make millions of dollars in gifts and other perks. How are checks and balances supposed to compete with that? Story 155. The system should be rigid, with no wiggle room, to keep everyone at the same level of power. The fact that it is failing shows how poorly it works when all branches are overseen by the same people. Story 156. There are no checks or balances, and no adults in the room to help. I fear we have reached a full-fledged authoritarian slide. Jimmy Kimmel just lost his job North Korea style. Story 157. They were effective, but over time there have been too many ways to evade them by declaring an emergency. Worse, the office with the greatest incentive to use temporary powers to bypass checks and balances is the same office that can declare an emergency. Story 158. I do not think people understand the Christian component here. This is an evangelical takeover of America, period. Literally everything they are doing is intended to enact some form of Christian Sharia law. There are a lot of exceedingly wealthy religious fanatics in this country, and they see Donald Trump as their opportunity to finally override the Founding Fathers' intent on a wall of separation between church and state. No one touches on this aspect. Christians are treated like a third rail that cannot be discussed. All over the world, there is one common thread for oppression, war, and death: organized religion. More than anything else, we need to end religious extremism. It is a plague on humanity. Story 159. We are seeing it actively stress-tested. It is a problem when those doing their jobs are replaced by loyalists, since humans are motivated by money and political power. In theory, checks and balances are good, but like any good idea, they can be ruined by people. Story 160. The Senate and the Electoral College are poison pills that make the checks and balances ineffective because they asymmetrically empower a minority of voters. Story 161. They do not seem to be working because the Founding Fathers did not envision that the people, or at least enough of them, would support the tyrants. Story 162. It is achingly clear in the last decade that those checks and balances are not working. Story 163. Our system of checks and balances is essentially based on a gentleman's agreement that everyone will adhere to it. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches have been seized by radical fascist ultranationalists. I encourage all liberals to stay informed and take peaceful action soon. Story 164. I like the concept of checks and balances. We should try that again in America. Corruption is a part of life. Let us consistently stay ahead of it. Story 165. It is a great idea. However, when the people responsible for checks and balances go golfing, or when half of them travel abroad to collect their coercive payments instead of performing oversight, things go haywire quickly. Story 166. Having studied political philosophy, sociology, economics, and politics for 25 years, I must say that the United States looks like the biggest joke. The system does not work. Story 167. We have checks and balances? I think we might be living in different timelines. Story 168. I am guessing the checks are in the mail because there are not any that seem to be working. Story 169. Gentlemen's agreements on behavior were the most reckless decision America has ever made. They will ultimately destroy the country because we cannot go back. Without enforcement against criminals on both sides to prevent corruption, it is only a matter of time. Story 170. We have never had a democracy. The country was founded on genocide and slavery, and that has not changed. This country has always been and will remain a dictatorship owned and run by the rich. Story 171. Unfortunately, no matter how good the system is, if many people want to destroy it, they can, especially wealthy people. Story 172. They believed we would always act in good faith. The system was not meant for con artists to take over. Story 173. Russia trashed them all when they got Trump's second season. Story 174. It was a good idea in theory and generally worked on a small scale, but it failed when under stress. It stopped working when people ceased to act in good faith. The Citizens United decision allowed a massive influx of money into politics and incentivized rampant corruption. Story 175. I think it would be nice if the ones we have would work, but they clearly do not because they require people in positions of power to resist the lure of self-interest and to stand up for something they believe in, and that is not something we can rely on anymore. Story 176. It is the only protection we have from overreaching presidents and their administration. Story 177. Checks and balances only work when we let them work. I think we're seeing that right now. If someone doesn't care about those checks and balances and finds a bunch of other people who also don't care, they become kind of worthless. Story 178. It is like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. You only believe in them when you are a child. Story 179. Checks and balances are dead. All Trump needed to do was pack the Supreme Court with his own goons. Story 180. We had checks and balances. The Supreme Court recently ruled them illegal. In effect, the decision said the president could do anything. Most politicians put party before country. Story 181. So far, I have seen checks flying around, mainly from the big tech companies. There are no balances unless we are talking about the bank balances of some politicians. Story 182. America is over. There are no checks and balances anymore. We just watch it crumble. Story 183. The system is not working. The system depends on the people in the other branches of government to keep each branch in check. Right now, the other two branches are filled with people who have no intention of ever opposing Trump. Story 184. Ah, the wonderful world of yesteryear. Thanks for the trip down nostalgia lane. I really miss America. Story 185. Republicans have dismantled it. Now that it is gone, they will suffer along with everyone else, but not one of them sees it. Story 186. Republicans and the Supreme Court ceded theirs to dear leader Trump and the Christian fascists of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Story 187. It does not work anymore. Trump has this country by the fucking balls and is slowly stripping away everything that made America great. Story 188. Are these checks and balances in this room with us right now? Story 189. The United States government, over the years, has developed to be safe from those in positions of power by trusting that the powerful will not use their back office understanding of how government actually works to game the system for personal advantage, while simultaneously hollowing out government to the point that it is floundering and impotent against insider attacks. Meanwhile, the populace is confused and easily manipulated so that, if allowed to vote again, they might vote against their own interests. Americans have become single-issue voters and have confused voting with sporting events where there are clear winners and losers. They have begun to view election winners as the best to govern, when in fact they were only better at gaming the system to get people to vote for them, not governing. Matt Gaetz is a classic example. So is Marjorie Taylor Greene, N.A., representative from Colorado. The list goes on. The population naively views winners as the best to govern and believes losers should not be given even the slightest chance. Once elected, many feel free to do whatever they want and break laws, and many do. The United States is in a very sad state. During the whole debacle of the last 8 or 9 years, I, an atheist, have had the biblical phrase, "sow the wind and reap the whirlwind," from Hosea 8 verse 7 on my mind, and it troubles me. Even though I do not believe in biblical teachings, the phrase has percolated into my thinking because it describes what is happening in our government without pointing fingers. Collectively, our entire government has been sowing the wind for years, and now everyone except those who govern is reaping the whirlwind, and I hate it. I find myself angry at the right for the tyranny they dole out and at the left for allowing it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.